The ancient world could be a dangerous and often unforgiving place. Early humans needed to protect themselves, their families, and their homes from a multitude of threats, including wild animals and eventually other tribes of humans who potentially threaten their own. We often imagine these early humans to be defending themselves with simple spears and stone points, but in reality, their arsenals were a lot more complex. The type of weapons used by early human tribes differed depending on the time and place, with more complex and varied weapons beginning to crop up in the archaeological record, alongside the advent of metalworking and smithing. Eventually, humans would get creative with their weapons, altering them to suit specific situations in order to get a combat advantage against their opponents. In today's video, we will be looking at some of the earliest forms of weaponry. How did our earliest ancestors defend themselves against the threat-ridden worlds of old? This is a trip that will take us through both time and space, as we explore the tools of war and defense utilized by several ancient civilizations and cultures. The first humans to use weapons did so on their ancestral continent, Africa, or at least the first evidence we have of ancient weaponry comes from Africa. In the Sabudu Cave, a rock shelter naturally carved into a sandstone cliff in northern KwaZulu-Natal, in what is today South Africa, archaeologists have unearthed simple stone tips that were crafted onto wooden spears to give a dangerous cutting edge to the simple whittled wooden sticks used by our even earlier ancestors. The humans here had begun to utilize what would go on to be one of the most world-changing innovations the world would ever see: the very first weaponry. By chipping away at pieces of jagged stone and attaching them onto their spears, these humans could bring down their fast-moving animal prey much more efficiently. Rather than simply pierce the hide of an antelope or buffalo, a stone-tipped spear would slice at the hide of a beast as it made contact, creating larger wounds. Larger wounds means more blood loss by the animal in the early stages of the hunt, which in turn leads to it to tire or fall easily. This would have saved these hunters time and energy when gathering food for their tribe, all from this simple modification. From the same site, archaeologists have discovered what appear to be arrowheads, dating back to around 60 to 70,000 years ago. There is no evidence present of the bow that may have been used to fire them, but the stone points found in this case are much smaller than those that would have tipped spears, allowing the arrow to travel faster and further when launched. Bows would go on to be some of the most widely used and effective weapons used by humans for hundreds of years to come. To be able to strike a target from a long way off without spending energy throwing a spear, and with a much greater degree of accuracy, revolutionized the way people hunted and fought across the world. Bows from different parts of the world would eventually go on to take a wide variety of forms for different uses. Recurved bows, long bows, short bows, and straight bows, to name a few. The oldest known example of an intact bow from prehistory comes from much further north, the cold bogs of Denmark. Sometime around 6000 BCE, several bows were crafted from the wood of an elm tree in the Holmgard region. Take one look at the artifact and you can see just how well crafted and effective these weapons would have been. A narrow handle is accompanied on either side by two long, immaculately carved stretches of wider elm wood, which would have allowed the bow to remain sturdy and stable when the archer was aiming it. Arrows would have been launched from these bows much quicker and more accurately than those that fired the stone points found in prehistoric South Africa. But these weapons would still undergo a multitude of different changes across the course of history. From this point in time, bows begin to crop up throughout the remainder of what can be considered prehistory. Some of the civilizations, including the ancient peoples of Egypt, would be the first to utilize the longbow, a much larger weapon that could fire a projectile further and faster, with a greater degree of accuracy than those found in the Danish bogs. These weapons would have required skill to use, however, and would have been used both for hunting and for combat purposes. The early civilizations of the Middle East and Egypt would also be amongst the first peoples to utilize the composite bow, energy-efficient bows that were curved in order to fire arrows quickly and with great speed. A direct hit from a composite bow could have caused immense damage to an opponent if fired correctly. These new techniques would soon spread to the wider reaches of Eurasia, where the early civilizations of China would utilize them to great effect. Bows here would be crafted from bamboo and would play important parts in ancient Chinese mythologies and texts. Before long, ancient civilizations and communities would discover the many uses of metal, materials that would revolutionize the way weapons were made, and greatly enhancing the damage they could deal in combat. The first metal to be utilized in this way was copper. Discovered first in modern-day Anatolia, an area that encompasses most of modern-day Turkey, early humans would slowly begin to phase out their stone points and arrowheads, with ones that were skillfully crafted with metal. These early weapons could be strengthened further by creating bronze, an alloy produced when mixing copper with tin. These weapons would become much more durable. They didn't need to be maintained and replaced as quickly as those made out of stone or pure copper, and due to their solid build and sharper edges, could create much deeper wounds when utilized against an enemy or animal. Bronze weapons soon began to take a much wider variety of forms than those made out of simple stone points. Spears would become longer and sturdier, tipped with bronze points that could be thrown into an enemy, or instead used as a close-range jabbing weapon. Using a spear in melee combat would give the user a significant range advantage, helping a warrior get the first hit in before his axe or blade-wielding opponent had even got within striking distance. Ancient peoples in what is now China would become masters at creating long-ranged melee weapons, such as spears, poleaxes, and dagger axes. When swung, a poleaxe could cause immense wounds with its short yet deep blade head, but doubled up as a spear with a long, sharp point at the tip to suit specific combat situations. Dagger axes were much more intricately and creatively designed, some of which feature multiple ornately carved blades for slashing and cutting at the enemy. Bronze could also be used to reinforce composite and longbows, making them more durable. A reinforced bow would not be replaced as often, and would ensure that in times of war or conflict, an archer's bow would not break whilst aiming or firing, a small modification that could easily be the difference between life and death. With all these new and improved methods of inflicting damage onto another human being, there was soon an immediate need for protection. Communities could construct wood or stone walls around their settlements to stop raiders or enemies from getting in, or at least delay their efforts. But what happened if you were attacked away from the safety of a walled village? In an almost evolutionary response, it was not long before the first armor started to appear on the scene. The first armor was constructed from leather and would serve to stop or at least lessen the devastating impact of blades and arrowheads if they were to come into contact with a fighter. Simple helmets and protective coverings for the torso, layered and reinforced to protect the most vital parts of the human body, were crafted and distributed amongst those who were fit for combat for when the need arose. These were efficient at first, but what happened when weapons got stronger? Heavier, more creative weapons constructed from iron and eventually steel would require a greater degree of protection than simple leather armor. As a response to this, craftsmen and smiths would begin crafting armor out of the very same material that were used to attack their men: metals. Bronze came first, which saw much greater degrees of protection offered to those who needed it in times of conflict. Moreover, metal armor could be reinforced with partial plates that would protect the arms, legs, and more importantly, the neck from attack. Later, these early designs would be adapted into several forms, such as chainmail and full plate armor. Soon, fully fledged civilizations would begin cropping up around the Middle East in an area known as the Fertile Crescent. Abundant wetlands, floodplains, easy access to rivers, and fertile soil would see regions such as Egypt, Gaza, Iraq, Syria, and more producing the world's first empires, some of which included the Sumerians, Hittites, and Akkadians. Established empires would grow immensely rich and powerful off these resource-plenty lands. And where there is wealth, there are people who want to take it. Attacks from raiders or so-called barbarians would become increasingly common with the advent of these early empires, and their borders would need protection if they were going to maintain their power and status. New weapons were soon developed that could suit different styles of fighting. Combat tools would begin cropping up that could match every use, and with the discovery of iron, such weapons were typically much more durable. Adding to the arsenal we have already described were iron maces, swords, clubs, and chariots, all of which were hugely successful in defending the lands of these early civilizations. Some of the world's first soldiers would have been a force to be reckoned with, standing atop their horse-drawn chariots whilst wielding both iron spears and reinforced bows, protecting themselves with chainmail armor and protective helmets. Such weaponry would soon spread north into Greece, and before too long, these protective and offensive tools were staples in creating some of the most iconic and well-known empires in all of history. Eventually, however, a new need arose. It was one thing to protect your borders from raiders on land, but what happened when your attackers arrived within your borders via the sea? For civilizations such as the ancient Egyptians, the waters of the southern Mediterranean Sea and the River Nile were staple to their success as an empire. Trade ships and fishermen populated these waters in huge numbers, and soon fell victim to raiders who would sail out to attack and steal from them. Some of the first responses to these attacks were for the Egyptians as well as the Phoenicians to attach simple catapults or slings to their vessels when sailing. Heavy stones could then be launched at an enemy ship, smashing through the hull and potentially taking out several members of the crew on board in one shot, should it be timed and aimed correctly. In some cases, bows would be carried on board what were primarily trade ships, in case of such emergencies. These simple solutions would form the basis of the world's first navies. With the dawning of the New Kingdom, the ancient Egyptians would begin to make major changes to their boats to ensure the success of their trade and the safety of their fishermen. Bigger boats that could stay at sea for longer would soon become commonplace, and it was uncommon for trade ships to go without major defensive adjustments. This would develop further when naval warfare became a necessity to keep empires safe from opposing civilizations. The Egyptians were known to have developed warships suitable for ranged and melee naval combat, complete with a crew of archers and spearmen, along with a heavy iron battering ram that could be used to cleave through opposing vessels. As time progressed and the ancient world was left behind, weaponry would continue to advance at often alarming paces. Strategy would be heavily employed to assist civilizations in winning wars, which saw some of the most creatively cruel weapons arrive from the minds of engineers and metalworkers. Vast armies would be formed to conquer and invade other nations, forming the basis of the wars that continue to be fought to this day. War and weaponry have been constants in the history of mankind, and each and every one can be traced back to those simple stone points crafted in the ancient depths of Africa.